right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Dole Institute and happy start of the spring 2024 semester. Let's give yourselves a round of applause. You're here. Try not to knock over the microphone. So glad to see you all at the Dole Institute. For those of you who don't know, my name is Audrey Coleman, and I'm the director of the Dole Institute. This is just a wonderful kickoff tradition that we've had for many years to welcome all of you who are members of SAB, and then also those of you who might be interested in joining our Student Advisory Board. Tonight we have a fantastic program for you, led by our wonderful, intrepid Student Advisory Board Coordinator, Ali Hagar, and I'm going to let her introduce our distinguished guests here in a minute. But first, I have a lot of announcements for you. One thing about Senator Bob Dole, the late Senator Bob Dole, he liked many things, but top two is to make policy with members of his own party and members of the opposite party to build better lives for all Americans. Okay, number one. Number two, he loved to mentor and uplift Kansans. And that tradition is really what propels us here at the Dole Institute and really motivates us to put so much investment and energy and cultivate this wonderful group called the Student Advisory Board here at the Dole Institute. So next week is an exceptional week, and it's only the start of the semester, so we have lots and lots of opportunities for you. I'm going to share a few of those for you before I turn the floor over. I'm going to introduce our Dole Fellow actually first before I turn it over to Ali. But if you remember nothing else, you'll want to be sure and come back to the Dole Institute on Tuesday, February 6th at 5:30 p.m. for our first Student Advisory Board meeting. The following afternoon on February 7th, on Wednesday at 3 p.m., we're going to host our first Fort Leavenworth Series program in partnership with the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. These are wonderful military history scholars from Leavenworth. Their series is about world leaders during wartime this year. It's going to be fantastic. They're going to be profiling General George Marshall, the mastermind behind the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. We have lots of wonderful discussions this year to talk about leadership and military leadership here at the Institute this year. Wednesday evening, that same evening, from 5 to 8, we're going to be hosting two visiting fellows from the Bipartisan Policy Center, experts on economic policy and the federal budget and development of the federal budget. That's between 5 and 8 p.m. Ali's going to send a bunch of follow-up information, but you're going to watch for information about registering for that on the GroupMe, because you'll need to register. But this is a great opportunity to interact with these visiting fellows from the Bipartisan Policy Center in Washington, D.C. On Friday, next Friday, in the Big 12 room at the Kansas Union, first Pizza and Politics of the semester with Cass Casmus, who's been our coordinator this year. We're going to talk about homelessness in Lawrence with City Commissioner Mayor Lisa Larson and Misty Bosch Hastings, who's with the Lawrence Homeless Program. Another wonderful, fascinating discussion. So this is just a rich opportunity for lots of conversations with you all, and I'm so pleased to turn things over and introduce to you our Dole Fellow for 2023 and 24, who is a board member of the Kansas Rural Center, also a county commissioner, also the chairwoman of the county commission, Karen Wiley. Please come up and tell us more about your discussion group series.
Thank you, Audrey. Karen Wiley, County Commissioner, and I'm very excited to be in this role. This was an unexpected opportunity to kind of bring forth a passion that I've had for a long time and that is become especially critical, and that is getting your voices back into local policy. We need to hear from you. So the series itself is to talk about policy implications around sustainability and ecology that will run the gamut from federal to state to some very local issues that have global impacts. So we have two conversations that will happen before spring break in February, and those will be a fairly traditional format where we'll hear from some speakers and have a question and answer time after that. The second two pieces will be more interactive, and the hope is that we get you and your voices talking with folks in the community who are engaged and are also talking about these topics. So we will hit the Farm Bill, which actually we can thank Senator Bob Dole for really marrying the urban and rural concerns in one very large omnibus bill. 3/4 of that is nutrition assistance. So that's one conversation we will have on the federal level. We'll talk about water policy in the state of Kansas and what that means for the future of all of us. Then we'll have some conversations around renewable energy and climate adaptation. So I'm very excited to have you part of that process. The idea is we're moving beyond just having two worldviews or two competing worldviews in making policy where someone has to win and someone has to lose, and moving instead towards how do we collaborate and bring stakeholders to the table, how do we learn to talk to each other, move outside of our silos, and have conversations that really benefit all of us. So there's a lot of work in that space. Not all of that will happen here or with me, but it will happen with you and the conversations that you have from here on out also. So I'm very glad to be a part of it and hope you will join us for those conversations. Thanks, Audrey.
Thank you, Karen. And I should recognize two very important Student Advisory Board members, the coordinators of the discussion group, Rachel Creighton and Braden Bangalin. Yeah, wave. Who've been working with Karen and all of you to develop this wonderful series. So we're really looking forward to that. Okay, I'm ready for my turn to be over. Allie, are you ready for this? You ready to take it over? All right. Everybody join me in welcoming Allie Hagar, who's going to introduce our two wonderful guests this evening.
And thank you so much, Karen, and all you guys for joining us tonight. I could not be more honored to have our two guests here tonight. So I'll first introduce Francesca. She's a White House correspondent for USA Today, and she's covered presidents, vice presidents, and politicians competing for the nation's highest office since 2014. Prior to working at USA Today, she covered campaigns, elections, in the White House for McClatchy, as well as thedailymail.com. And she's a proud graduate of the William Allen White School of Journalism. She's also a poli-sci major here at the University of Kansas, and she was an SAB member. She's also a former member of the White House Correspondents Association. And then Eugene Daniels is a White House correspondent for Politico and a Playbook co-author since joining Politico in 2018. He's covered the midterms, the Democratic presidential primary, and the general election. He is a senior Morning Joe contributor and an MSNBC political analyst. He's also on the board of the White House Correspondents Association and will be president of the organization beginning in June 2024 through June 2025. So prior to Politico, Eugene worked as a political reporter at Newsy and began his career at local news in Colorado Springs, and he graduated from Colorado State University in 2012. So we're so honored to have you two here tonight. And just to begin, can you tell me a little bit about your background, how you got interested in politics, and what made you go into journalism?
You first. Hey everybody, I'm very happy to be here. My sister is a KU grad. She was a Rock Chalk Jayhawk dancer, so I spent a lot of time in Lawrence years ago. Happy to be back. I also love these because I kind of feel like Britney Spears or Beyonce or something. If you see me touching it, that's why, because I'm singing. So I was a kid who was really obsessed with politics growing up. My family members were always obsessed with politics. My grandfather, who I never actually got to meet, was a Baptist preacher in South Carolina, so spent a lot of his time using that lane and working to get Black people the right to vote, and then eventually, when they had the right to vote, registering them to vote. So the idea of politics and the importance of politics is deep in our family, and I had this idea that I wanted to be a lawyer and then a politician and then the first Black president of the United States, and that is what I said when I was 6 years old, because I was a very weird child. I got beat to one of those gigs, and I was at Colorado State University studying political science and kind of pre-law, and I was in a class and learning about special interest groups and special interests and what the kinds of things that politicians sometimes feel they have to do in order to succeed in Washington, D.C., and it didn't really jive with how I wanted to live my life. So I kind of left distraught and very dramatically and I had taken one journalism class and talked to the professor at the time, and what she told me, she said, maybe you don't want to be a powerful person, maybe you want to hold powerful people accountable. And that's kind of how that kind of all started for me. And then I did local TV, went to Newsy, and then found myself very fortunately at Politico.
Well, I am a proud graduate of the University of Kansas, and I actually am sit on the board of trustees for the School of Journalism here, which is an incredible honor as well. And I have to be careful with the bow I'm giving tonight because my family is here, and I often make jokes sometimes about some of these things too, but I feel like a little bit nervous. Both my dad, my brother, and my grandma are sitting over there. I got first interested in all of this when I was doing debate and forensics in high school, and I'm actually going to embarrass a friend. A friend tonight here competed against me in debate in high school, but you made me so much better. And now I get to do all of this on television as well, and that's been an incredible opportunity too. So I did debate forensics in high school and then went to the University of Kansas where I majored in political science as well as journalism. And when I was in college, I tried covering different things at the student newspaper, but I didn't really enjoy any of them as much as politics. And I knew I wanted to do journalism related to politics, but it was really reinforced when I had the chance to go to the Republican and Democratic national conventions as a student journalist, and I got to cover the 2008 presidential election when Barack Obama was running, and at the time as well, John McCain was running against him, and that was really cool. So I got bit by the political bug hardcore then, and ended up moving to Washington, D.C. before I ever graduated, actually, about 6 months beforehand to finish up my time there and do an internship there. And I really didn't want to leave after that, and I was really dedicated to finding a way to make it work. And it was tough because that was when, shortly after the 2008 financial crisis, and I feel that's so similar to some of the challenges that our industry is facing right now. And I just want students to know who are trying to find a job coming out of the pandemic that it might take some time to do so, but you should keep following your passions and following your dreams and make it work if that's what you really want to do. And it eventually, I do think that it will work out. It certainly did for me.
Thank you. So what does a typical day look like as a White House correspondent? What percentage of your work is travel? How much in advance do you learn about the president's schedule?
It depends.
We're both laughing. We'd love to learn about the president's schedule often a lot quicker than I think that we do. Sometimes it can be like midnight the night before. They'll tell you what he's got on his schedule the next day. But sometimes we do get guidance about a week beforehand of a lot of the events, which helps to plan our schedule. But some of the things are just happening in real time. I mean, we don't know that some of these things are going to happen until they're happening.
Yeah. One of the things that's really fascinating and amazing about, I think, our gigs are that every day feels different.
Yeah.
Like every single day feels different. I know everybody that has a job says that, but these jobs really do feel like that. One day you might be traveling with the vice president to South Carolina, and then the next week you'll be on Air Force One going with the president to another country, right? And so it's kind of all over the place, which makes it really interesting and fascinating. And you get this front row seat to history. The percentage of our jobs that are travel, it kind of depends. We have a team of 8 at Politico, and so we all kind of take a week of coverage. So luckily not that much, but now that we're getting into the election, we're starting to travel on our own to certain places. I spent a lot of time in South Carolina, none in Iowa, New Hampshire, because it is cold, and I do not do the cold. Yeah.
Growing up in Kansas, I got to spend a lot of time in the cold, and I went to Iowa, and it was snowing, by the way, but I left. I went to New Hampshire, and then it started snowing.
Yeah.
I went to DC,
snowing. It was like negative 40 in Iowa.
It was really, really cold, and I am looking forward to South Carolina.
It's warm here as well, but yeah.
Today.
Today, not last week. So describe your experiences like in the White House press room. So what is the atmosphere like? How do you interact with members of the Biden administration? Is there anything like the audience might be surprised to learn about what goes on?
Surprised to know. I mean, there's so much in the actual room. What I often find is we don't get a lot of our questions answered in that way. If you're watching and you're wondering, like, they're writing this story right after this briefing, they clearly got that information from there. We do not. They do a really good job of not answering our questions in a way that would be helpful for us or you. And so a lot of it is kind of before the briefing and after the briefing, getting information from people who are not supposed to tell you information and convincing them to do that, which is a fun part of the job as far as I'm concerned, because I'm super nosy, which helps in this job. And it's surprising that you guys would want to know. I mean, sometimes when you watch the back and forth and it feels very aggressive, there's no long-standing, like, I think, animosity between us and the press secretary or the whoever. Everybody kind of knows what the roles are, and a good press secretary understands the give and take, and more importantly, understands that it's our job to hold them accountable as some of the most powerful people on the planet. So that's one. And also, I was always told the White House beat was full of a bunch of sharks that hated each other, and that's just like not true at all. We all get along for the most part. Everyone's very helpful when you first start on the beat. People kind of walk you around and show you the places you can go and shouldn't go. Otherwise, Secret Service will shoot you, so don't go over there. So that is always great. And so the camaraderie within the press corps actually is, I think, often surprising to people.
But the camaraderie among the press corps is, I think, increased a lot over the time that I have been there as well. And and you and I have both worked on this. So he chairs the scholarship committee on the WHA board now, and I chaired it prior to that. And I think we both worked really hard to try and make sure that it's a welcoming place for young people to come in and have those opportunities that maybe we didn't have when we were growing up. And if anyone's interested, by the way, there's a scholarship through the WHA that's connected to the University of Kansas as well, if anyone's ever interested in trying to do this for a living. I do think that people come to the White House and they're really surprised by how small the press room is. Like, anyone who's ever watched any of the political television shows comes in and they're like, it's just so small. And up until recently, they constantly were like, it's not nearly as nice as I thought that it was going to be. But there was just a revamp, actually. So it's quite nice. If you've seen it before and thought that, please come back. It's a little bit nicer now. There's new carpet, new chairs.
There's new chairs,
There's new
desks
chairs.
and walls.
It still has that new chair smell, actually.
Yes.
There's a smell that's nice about that. And so it's a lot smaller, and you can't go as many places as people think. I think that people think that we can go. Like, you're limited to going into the press room, the workspace, the press secretary's office, basically, and that is it. You can't just wander about the property, to his point about Secret Service, even if you're a permanent pass holder like we are. That's just not how it works. And shortly off of the press secretary's office, if you take like a right, you go into the press office. If you take a left, you go to the Oval Office. You don't want to take the left.
Don't do that.
Unless you're invited to take the left, like, don't take the left. They have their eyes on you the entire time, too. And you're like, don't worry, I'm taking a right.
Yeah, so kind of going off that, how do different administrations and press secretaries run their briefing room, and how does that affect your work?
You want to start?
Yeah, so I started during the last 2 years of the Obama administration, which was obviously quite different than the beginning of a new administration, whether that was Trump or that was Biden, because he was finishing the second part of a 2-year term. So he was on his way out and had some things that he wanted to achieve. At the same time, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley were running at that time. So he really wanted to stay out of the fray at some points and not do as many activities because they were out there campaigning. And so that was actually a great time period for me, though, to come in. I felt like, because there were so many of the other journalists who were more established, who were out on the campaign trail more frequently. So it gave me an opportunity to, to really get called on in the White House press briefing. And I remember actually having been there for a couple months, and the press secretary at the time was Josh Earnest. And I hadn't been getting called on because I was working for an outlet that was brand new. We had just launched. It had existed for a long time, but we had just launched our Washington bureau. I was their first ever White House correspondent, so I was absolutely making it up as I went along. And there's definitely not a handbook when you're at a brand new organization. At the bigger organizations, there's White House correspondents to tell you, hey, here's how things are done. But I was making it up as I went along, trying to figure things out. And finally, someone who tells me, well, you can just go up to the press secretary's office and, like, introduce yourself. And I'm like, no, I did not know, because I thought, again, you can't wander. I did not know that was possible for me to do. So I go out there and I tell him, if you just call on me today and tomorrow, I will leave you alone for 2 weeks. I won't even ask you for anything else. And he's like, this feels like a trap. And I'm like, yes, because I'm going on vacation for 2 weeks. So if you just call me today and tomorrow, you won't have to worry about it again. But I did. I got called on. And then he remembered me, and then he started calling on me more frequently afterwards. And it gave me an opportunity to practice and try my skills. And I, too, ended up going out on the campaign trail pretty significantly that year. But that was how I got my leg up initially and got that practice. And then, you were there in the Trump administration too. I feel like maybe I can drop the ball there and maybe you want to pick it up.
The Trump administration and the press secretaries, every press secretary was a little bit different. And often, every press secretary, whether they're in the White House, whether they're a Republican or a Democrat, whether they work in Congress, they're always trying to spin you, right? They're always, some of you may do that if you become press secretaries. You're always trying to convince us that maybe we have it wrong, right? So that's number one. They all do that. Something that was and felt very different during the Trump administration is a lot of the times it was like, don't believe your lying eyes, right? Like, everyone remembers Sean Spicer's very first briefing where he said that it was the biggest crowd that had ever been a crowd, and we had all seen the pictures, and we knew that wasn't true. And so I think that's where the camaraderie came during the for the press corps, because what you start to realize is we all share one goal, right? And it's holding them accountable. And so I think it kept some of the teeth out of there. It is much tougher to engage with folks when they're just outright lying to you, when it's not spin, right? I expect the spin. We're trained to deal with the spin. It's harder when folks are just lying. The Biden administration has been, we've had 2 press secretaries so far, Karine Jean-Pierre, who's the current, and then Jen Psaki, who was the former, and then now has a TV show and is a host on MSNBC. And they're also very different, right? I think Jen enjoyed the back and forth. Like, she really enjoyed the kind of tussle between reporters and press secretaries. And then she became known for the sake bombs, where she would like embarrass us. I never felt embarrassed. I'm like, I felt fine about it. But that, and Karine's a little bit different in that way, right? And every press secretary is different. And our job is to kind of figure out how they work to try and get some information out of them. We go on TV, but we don't work primarily in the TV space. So we don't need like a soundbite for our jobs as they do. And so they spend a lot more time in that front row with the television folks trying to gather at least one quote that is usable for them. But they all come to the job differently, and it's our job to figure out how they operate to try to catch them on the back foot.
I feel like we have a huge responsibility in that room to ask questions that are in the public interest. And so, at least the way that I approach it is I try to see areas where they haven't answered the question, like, how can I add to this conversation? And if I'm not adding to it, then why am I talking? Let someone else have an opportunity if I don't feel like I have anything to add at that point. But as you were talking about the differences between press secretaries and the way administrations handle them. So for instance, when I was talking about Josh Earnest, he's actually a Kansas City native, by the way. That was the other way I got my foot in the door, is I was like, I'm from Kansas City. And in the Trump administration, at a certain point during the pandemic, if you recall, Donald Trump himself would just get up there and he was taking questions. They weren't even having the press secretary take questions, like he was fielding the questions. And I think some of the difficulty during the Trump administration too is that if the press secretary hadn't spoken to the president that day, or hadn't spoken to him maybe sometimes within the last 15 minutes, he would be saying things on Twitter that were not the same as what was being said in the briefing room. Or sometimes if the administration would even issue, like they call it administrative policy on issues, he would then tweet something that was different, and there was an actual difference between the White House's position and the president's position, and that made it difficult. You had to really state, like, the White House has said, or the press secretary has said, and be very clear about that. And we have a rule about getting 2 sources on things as well. And the difficulty then was, like, you could have multiple people telling you something, right, which meets the rule that we, industry standard. We can certainly run with one thing if the one thing is, like, the commander-in-chief is the source on it, or the chief of staff or whatever. But you could have multiple people saying things, and it's still not actually line up with the policy then ended up being, and that was very hard to sort through, even if you were someone who had a lot of experience. Whereas I think now we're back in a position where, generally speaking, if the White House issues an administrative policy decision, you can count on that to be it. But sometimes even then, I think that it still can shift. A more recent example is the White House had been declining to comment on the deals of what was in the border deal, right? They're like, we don't comment on speculation of what may or may not be in there. And then
we don't negotiate in public.
We don't negotiate in public, right? We're not going to speculate. We don't negotiate in public. But then on Friday night, they issued a statement from the president commenting on some of the things that were in the deal that hasn't even come together. Unless I missed something,
Nope.
I still don't think it's been published, the deal. And then their response was, the other day, Karine from the podium was like, look, if the president wants to comment on something like that, that's for him to do, but I'm not going to be doing that from the podium and getting in front of the president. And so I still think that no matter who it is, you still would deal with that a little bit. They're just the spokesperson for the principal or for the building, and it's always better to get that information from the president themselves, which is why we push so hard for the president to do more press conferences, whether they're with foreign leaders or alone, because we want to hear directly from him.
Yeah, or at the very least, him walk past us when he's walking to the helicopter, right? And we can kind of convince him to come over, because we can spend days and days and days tussling with Karine about a question and asking and wanting information, and we just ask him and he will typically answer it. If you get him to stop, he will typically give you an answer that you can run with and also take to the bank. So that's always, it's a give and take, and it's also a game of patience and a lot of hurry up and waiting.
Yeah, so can you tell me a little bit about your writing process, how you choose what to write about, like what role your editors play in that process?
I think it depends. So sometimes, we're both, and all reporters are constantly talking to sources within the administration, in Congress, in the advocacy space. And what's really interesting about this administration, as opposed to the Trump administration, is there's a lot less leaks that are not authorized. In the Trump administration, people were just like leaking, like it was great for reporters, because they made a lot of reporters' careers, because we were just getting so much information all the time from inside the White House about what was going on, from meetings with what was happening in a meeting with the President of the United States, the Chief of Staff yelling at the Chief Strategist, and the Oval Office, those kinds of things that tell you a lot about how a White House runs and therefore how they're going to run the country. That doesn't happen as much now, so you kind of have to play an outside-in game. And talking to advocates, going on the Hill, talking on the Hill, and then coming to the White House with that information. So that's one. And then sometimes our bosses are like, go do that. That also happens. That happens quite a bit, because they, they're older and they've been doing it for longer, and so they're like, a lot of the things that we do at Politico sometimes, they will say, well, this is how they used to do it, then go write a story about why it feels different now. And the election right now is a really good example of how we do that, adding a lot of historical context to the conversation. So it's either our own conversations with sources, sometimes the White House will drop something in your lap, and then you have to be very careful, because why do they want you to have that information? And then our editors as well. And the great thing about the editor-reporter relationship is like an extreme relationship in trust. And so they have to trust that we are telling the truth, and we have to trust that they have our best interests at heart. And so, as you're writing and trying to create and ideate a story, or I talk to this many people, but I don't know what to do with it. And that is, they help you to craft that and mold it into a thing that makes sense for the readers.
And some of it isn't us choosing, because if the president decides to go somewhere, then that becomes the story. We have to, build around that sometimes. Or, for instance, like the State of the Union is coming up. He's going to announce a bunch of different policies that, may never happen, but we still have to, write about them. We still have to dig into them and look at the numbers, the possibilities, those sorts of things like that. So sometimes it chooses you. Or like if we look at the political calendar right now, we were talking about Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. The South Carolina Democratic primary is this weekend, so I know you were just, you were just there. I've been there recently too. So that's a story that kind of chooses you sometimes in some ways. But I think we've both worked really hard to create distinguishing beats, and both Eugene and I both cover Kamala Harris. We both have covered her a lot. And that's a choice. Like, I chose to cover the Vice President of the United States because I found it to be really fascinating. She's the first Black woman, the first, Asian woman to have that job too. And I just think it's a really interesting story to tell. So it's something that I've wanted to cover. And of course, seemingly she ran for president once before, so it seems like that might be something she'd be interested in doing again. And so there's some longevity to that storyline that doesn't end here or maybe even in 4 years. And so I try to pick things like that too. Like, it's good to do the news of the day, but what's something that's going to have some staying power that you can invest in sourcing on and people on and then keep building over time? And there's a lot of reporters who I think covered Joe Biden, for instance, in the United States Senate, and then they covered him as vice president, and I came there towards the end of his vice presidency. But there are some folks that were covering him that whole entire time, and now they've just got like the inside track on Joe Biden, in a way that, candidly, like I wasn't covering him back in the Senate 20 years ago. I don't know some of his pals in the same way that some of those reporters do. I just don't.
Yeah.
Yeah, so as we approach the election, how does that change your role as a White House correspondent, and what key aspects of the election are you focusing on?
I think it makes it more interesting. I think it makes the job more interesting because, sometimes the just covering what the White House is doing day to day can get kind of monotonous. There's still the history and there's the honor of being there, but especially with this administration, they want to be boring. And so it kind of becomes this like pulling teeth to get an interesting story out of there. And so it just adds a different dynamic to where, I do our flagship newsletter, Playbook, and we cover everything. And so, I have my White House role, but then with Playbook, that's why I'm going to South Carolina and spending some time there. And that is why my colleagues went to Iowa and New Hampshire. No, I did not. We'll do the conventions. And my favorite thing about election season is getting to talk to actual voters, right? Political, we spend a lot of time talking to powerful people, and what's really interesting in the election season is talking to people who want more power and think they, as human beings, want to see power act and behave differently. So that's really interesting. And I mean, my eyes are on largely the kind of coalition of Black voters and brown voters in this country in this election. They seemingly are changing the way they vote. How fast is that? How does that impact the election? How does that change the parties and their calculations as they move forward, the policies that they're actually interested in? Joe Biden has spent a lot of time in South Carolina. Today he was in Michigan hanging out with Black voters. That is not an accident. They're very aware that the base of the Democratic Party feels a little shaky at this point for some reason with Democrats. And like that is where it's an interesting story. It's an evolving story. It's been going on for a few years where we've started to see some shifts happening. And so I think that to me is the most fascinating story of 2024.
No, I agree. I mean, I talked about the VP, and I think that's an interesting story. And I'm also just keeping my eye too on, more broadly, other folks who might be wanting to run for president in 2028 and beyond. And I'm also our Nikki Haley reporter right now, so that is why I had to go to Iowa and New Hampshire, and I'll be heading down to South Carolina. So I've been covering the dynamic of the Republican Party and the folks who want to move on from Trump, the clash with the folks who clearly don't, how that's playing out, could be coming to a head here in the next couple weeks. And I just find that to be a really fascinating story, in addition to all of the great things you already said.
Yeah, so with recent events like the Israel-Hamas conflict, how do you approach covering international affairs as a White House correspondent, and what are some of the challenges that arise in reporting on such complex issues that the president may deal with?
Well, I love foreign policy. Like, that is where my passion is on the White House beat, to be honest. I mean, I love campaigns and elections and the campaign trail probably evenly as well on that. But this goes back to majoring in political science here. That was when I started to realize that was a real interest for me. The foreign policy aspect was when I was taking classes here on that. And then it's been a very cool opportunity to be able to cover it at the White House and travel with the president to all kinds of countries that I never dreamed as a child I would ever even step foot in. And I do think that this election, bringing it forward to now, I do think it's going to be a very big issue in the election, whether it's the Israel-Palestine conflict, whether it's Ukraine and what to do about Ukraine aid, whether this is about China and Taiwan and the potential for a conflict between those countries. It is such a big part of the conversation this election cycle, even if it doesn't come up like every day to day. But I mean, I think the fact that when you see the White House press briefing right now, and for I think like this entire year, it has been Karine Jean-Pierre and John Kirby, the National Security Council spokesperson, up there almost every single day together, tells you what important moment this is in foreign policy and how it plays into the White House. I mean, that is not the way that it has ever been in the past. I mean, sometimes the White House press secretary will bring in guests to come speak, but not at the pace that we've seen since, since Hamas attacked Israel. We have not seen them focus on foreign policy like that. I mean, and there's a lot of data in the polling that shows that this is a problem for the president potentially within the Democratic Party. There's a real split over that issue that he's having to juggle as he heads into the election. So I've written a lot about that, about the political peril that he faces as he tries to approach this issue, because he has what he feels like he has to do to govern and lead the country, but that is not always politically popular with the Democratic Party base right now. And that is going to continue. Like, that is a thing that's going to go all the way through and past the election.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things that has changed and that Donald Trump helped push and change is how different the parties view and think about and talk about foreign policy. You know, in the old days, the Republican Party talked a lot about spreading democracy to other countries, that we had a role in making sure that democracy worked on a global scale, and that we should be leaders on the world stage. And what Donald Trump did is say, no, I don't want to do that. And so he didn't. And so he came with this, his America First policy. And so within the Republican Party, there's a tussle, and Haley and Trump are perfect examples of this, of how that party is trying to figure out how important being a leader on the world stage is. In the Democratic Party, in addition to everything Fran just said, the president has been focused on foreign policy his entire career, right? Like in the Senate, he dealt with these issues and he cares deeply about, he kept saying, he keeps saying to leaders when he met with them, especially the first couple of years, is that like America's back, you know what I mean? And kind of what they take from that is there's a different type of foreign policy that's happening. And the interesting thing is politics used to stop at the water's edge, right? Like the president goes to another country and everyone like is on his side, whether you're Republicans or Democrats. That's not the case anymore. And so the way that foreign policy and how each party is trying to decide how they view America's role in the world has also impacted our domestic policy. And so it's all intertwined in a way that I think it hasn't been in a really long time. And it's really fascinating. I mean, immigration is also a foreign policy issue, right? This is an issue between our country and other countries, not just Mexico, but countries that folks are coming from. And so all of these things either put Joe Biden in peril or could, if he figures things out, could be to his benefit. And the daily TikTok is one thing, but kind of the large scale or the longer scale to how this country views itself on the world stage is really fascinating.
So on a different note, how has the rise of social media platforms influenced your work and the nature of political reporting?
Well, I feel like that's changed over time too.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, I'm not on social media as much as I used to be. I think coming out of the pandemic, thank you.
Healthy.
I think especially coming out of the pandemic, I'm just not on there as much as I used to be, partially we're so busy, right? Like you're out on it's like we're out on the campaign trail. There's all these things happening in the White House press briefing. You got to file. I've got like print newspaper deadlines as well. But I will say that it was a really good tool when I was starting to get my work out there. It still is a great tool to promote my work and get it out there and promote the work of my colleagues. I use it to keep the pulse on like what's taking place. I'm counting on other people using social media more. I love it when you tweet. I'm like, okay, now I know what's going on. And I do. I read what people are doing. I use it to look at clips of, I didn't realize this person had done an interview on this channel today, and now I know that, and I can watch those clips. So I think there's a lot of benefit to that. Members of Congress are on there. That's that's helpful because then you can scroll through in real time and see where various members of Congress stand on issues, and sometimes I use that to call up their offices and ask for interviews on those subjects. So there's a lot of benefits. I mean, I scroll, I like doom scroll social media, but I haven't. Yeah, but I'm not necessarily. I guess I'm just not myself like engaging as much as I used to. I think it's just, it's just really busy.
Yeah, I think for me, the interesting thing about social media is that it's kind of democratized the people's access to and sharing of information. And it's created kind of little, like people who are experts on things, even though they probably don't have a background in which you would think they would be an expert, and like zero in on something. And so for me, because I try to stay off of it, I'm not as good at all as I want to be, but I mostly use it for like sourcing, right? Like following someone, DMing them, finding who's talking to who. When someone asks someone who is going to work in the administration, now I need to find that person's information so I can cultivate them as a source. So that's typically what I use it for. I think that like largely, and especially Twitter, I'm always going to call it Twitter. I don't care. I don't care what it's called. But like it just feels like a cesspool of like bad ideas and hatred for the most part. You know what I mean? So like it's not actually as fun as it used to be. And there's things that have changed in the algorithm that actually make it less useful for us as reporters. It used to be much easier to see the kinds of things that that we're talking about and that you're looking for, but now it's just harder to do so. And so we have to figure out ways to kind of get around that. And also it's really important for us as political reporters and people that live in Washington, D.C. is that Twitter is not real life. You know what I mean? Like the things and the conversations happening on Twitter, that does not mean that your everyday American is having that conversation. Most Americans are not on Twitter. The vast majority of Americans are not on Twitter. Facebook, now that's a different story, right? But a lot more people are on Facebook. And I find Facebook a little bit more helpful to kind of keep the pulse of like the kind of like everyday American conversation.
So do you have a memorable or favorite story that you've written in your career of an event you've covered, and what made it stand out to you?
There's so many. I don't know how to choose just one. Do you have one that comes to mind?
Yep.
Okay, I'll go second.
So my favorite one is not a favorite because it was like someone really, well, they're very important and interesting to me. But like they don't work in politics. They did not and have never held political office. And I was on the video team at Politico. And we were trying to figure out how to cover what story to do for the 2020 primary. And we all knew that South Carolina was going to be the place that like Joe Biden made a comeback if he was going to be able to do that in the primary. My family's from South Carolina. Both sides have been there my entire life. And I was like talking to my boss about, and had always said to like my teammates, is like, he's going to win South Carolina and then he'll get the primary. He'll win the nomination. And I was like, you're crazy. And I was like, no, I'm telling you, like it's like, Iowa, New Hampshire, and Nevada were never built for him. And he's made that very clear by putting South Carolina first this time around. And my boss at the time said, why don't you go to South Carolina, interview a couple of politicians, but also interview your grandmother? And I was like, oh, what? Because we don't typically talk to our family members for stories. And the reason, and so I did that, and I spent like an hour on my grandmother's couch, so I got a free trip home, which was nice. It was a reminder that everyday people have really fascinating and interesting stories, and we don't need to just be talking to the people with power, right? My grandmother is now 86, she's on a fixed income. She lived in New York at one time, but mostly has lived her entire life in Bucksport, South Carolina, which none of you have heard of, and that's just fine. It's like 800 people that live there. She talked about, why she and the older people that were about to bring Joe Biden back from the dead in that primary liked him, right? And also told stories of in very fascinating consequence and extreme consequence about how she grew up, right? And being able to, help use me as the tool to tell the story about how my great-grandmother would take her 6 kids, there were 6 of them, and she would take a bucket with her when they would go out because the bathrooms were so disgusting that only Black people could use. And so like in 2020, if we all remember the racial reckoning that was going on, so being able to help tell that story at that time was also fabulous. This is my favorite story. I also got like an hour of footage from my family of my grandmother just telling like amazing stories that really only apply to our family. At some of it, and the rest of it I got to use for work. And also I interviewed.
You're giving me ideas now.
Yeah, Nana, Mom, what do you call it? And then earlier this year last year I guess I did a profile of the vice president and did like a sit down and all those things. And those are always like fascinating and fun.
Yeah, so there's a couple things that stand out. One of the more recent ones I've enjoyed, I did a profile on the UN ambassador, Linda Thomas Greenfield. She's got a really interesting backstory as well. When she grew up in segregation and then goes on to have this incredible job as the UN ambassador, and I really enjoyed, for some of the reasons you're outlining, telling that story, because I think so often our job is these stories where just like, here's all the things that the government is doing wrong, because that is our job, to hold the public accountable.
And there are a lot of them, a lot of things.
But sometimes it's really nice to be able to do a profile where you're like, here is a person who faced adversity and look what they did with their life. And I started that one with talking about how during the Rwanda genocide, she was mistaken for the prime minister of that country. They came to the door, they held her hostage because she was visiting that country at the time, and she was staying with someone in the US government who was working there and who lived next door to the prime minister. And so they came to the door and they mistook her for the prime minister. And they eventually find the prime minister and she gets shot and she gets killed. And so that's how I started this story. And it's really profound, right? In this woman, she still went on to stay working in this industry and then becomes the UN ambassador. And I just think that that's, an incredible story. And I really enjoyed working on that one recently. Two of the other ones that have really stayed with me are the one that I did following January 6th, inside the Oval Office and inside Trump's thinking, and how he had been told the days before that march on, the march on the Capitol, that he had originally planned to march with them. And then he was talked out of it by people in his administration. And the reason that they didn't want him to march was because they thought that the police would shut it down, essentially, if he went there. And so that one was important to me. I was the first person to write about sort of like the TikTok of how this had went down, coming out of the Oval Office on that day. So that one obviously has stayed with me as all these investigations and things have continued. But on the more, you were talking about South Carolina and it being first side, I've enjoyed covering the process. I might be the only person who enjoyed covering this process, but the process of how they chose South Carolina first, and the president wrote this letter to the Democratic National Committee on the eve of them making a decision about whether to kick Iowa out of the first slot in New Hampshire, and says that he wants, South Carolina to vote first. And I was at a state dinner. So the president was having a state dinner that night, the first state dinner of his administration, because the pandemic had happened, so he's having his first one quite late. And I had been at the state dinner that night, and I remember personally talking to the DNC chair and being like, hey, have you seen this letter? And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about, goodbye, and like asking all these people on the red carpet. And I end up, forming out this color story on how the DNC chair didn't know that Biden had issued this letter because he didn't have his phone, because he had just gotten, his wife had the phone, because she was taking all these pictures at the state dinner. So when I come up to him and I ask him about this, he's just like, I don't know what you're talking about. All these other people hadn't seen it yet either. And so that was a fun one to put together after the fact and use like the fact that he was like busy munching on a shrimp, and like, people were coming up and telling him about this, and people were walking down the red carpet and are like, what are you talking about? And then he called it a very emotional rollout, because the DNC chair is the former chair of the South Carolina Democratic Party, and he was the first Black man to run that party. So it was very important to him too, and telling the story through that lens That was a fun one. But yeah, that was another example of how it seemed like a one-day story, but it wasn't, because New Hampshire fought this tooth and nail, and so did Iowa. I'm sure you guys heard about the Iowa thing for like a year. This was like a saga, and then Biden had to do a write-in campaign in New Hampshire because he wasn't on the ballot there. So I was covering that in New Hampshire recently, and now it kind of comes to its head this weekend on Saturday when South Carolina cast its vote. So yeah, it's been a real year-and-a-half long thing.
Yeah, so as we start to wrap things up, what advice would you give to students who are interested in careers in politics or covering politics?
You want to go first?
I just talked a lot. Go ahead.
Okay. I have two pieces of advice, and I gave them to Francesca, who is doing the story this year, earlier, so she's already heard this. The first I stole from my mom, and it is, you belong in every single room you find yourself in. So she told us that as kids, and I didn't really know what she meant, because I was like, I'm in the cafeteria, what are you talking about? And the more access I got to people that are very smart and have a lot of power, you go in, and I think, there are not a lot of Black people that cover the White House and cover the beat and walk on those grounds. And so it can be really nerve-wracking. And it doesn't always feel like at the beginning, like, oh, why am I'm not supposed to be here. I don't look like it. I don't look like anyone that's here. I don't really think like a lot of the folks that are here. My career wasn't the same. I took some turns to get here. And so it's a lot of imposter syndrome. So what I always tell myself before a big interview or before I go into a gaggle or even the press briefing room is like, you belong in every single room you find yourself in, and you guys do as well. And the second is to have a plan would be very flexible. I don't know if you guys feel this way as students now, but when I was a student, I felt like I had to have like a 2-year plan, a 3-year plan, a 4-year plan, a 10-year plan, a 15-year plan, and a retirement plan. And my career, as I was in local TV, and I was hoping to be on air full time, and the general manager told me that my voice was too Black to be on air full time in Colorado Springs. And so I was like, oh, okay, well that wasn't on my plan, so now I have to think a little differently. And so from there I went to a digital video outlet, and then I went to Politico and in Washington, D.C. and covering the White House. So that career path is not typically how an average White House correspondent would get to that gig. And so plan, have goals in mind, but also be flexible for the things that are gonna come and kind of push you off of that track. And find new opportunities to stretch and do and utilize the tools that you have always wanted to utilize.
I agree with all of those things, and I would just build on that and say, too, don't be afraid to reach out to people who you want to learn from and ask them to get together with you. I try, by the way, if anybody in this room is interested in what we're doing and then wants to have a conversation at some point, I try to do the Zooms. I try to get together with folks. I'm always very excited when someone wants to come and be a White House correspondent. I think you will find that many people are happy to talk to students and happy to have those conversations. And I didn't do that as much of that when I was a student, because I was very like, oh my gosh, no, this person's like not going to write me back, and they're going to think this is crazy. But I think so many people are absolutely willing to have those conversations, and that applies outside of journalism too. If there's like someone who you want to learn from, you should, in whatever industry that is, reach out to them and ask if they'd be willing to just chat with you and have a conversation with you. You can learn so much from that. But I think the same thing in the workplace too. I'm still always learning. I meet once a month with my bureau chief, who's also an incredible Kansan, Susan Page. She's amazing, and a big reason why I wanted to go work at USA Today and work with her. And I still sit down and talk with her on a monthly basis about what can I be doing better. She was on the White House beat for 20 years. Like what can I be doing? How can I improve my work? Do you have any advice for me? Because you can always be learning at every point in your career. And I think that the mentorship aspect of it is just so important. And finding the right mentor too. Finding the right mentor who gets you and who wants to help you can take some time, but that's been so beneficial to me.
Yeah, so my last question before we turn it over to the audience for Q&A. So tonight you're at the Dole Institute White House Correspondents Brinner, but do you have any fun memories from the White House Correspondents Dinner? Do you have like a favorite comedian or any fun interactions from that event?
So 2 years ago, I guess it would have been 2 years ago, right after Biden got elected. It was his first year doing the White House Correspondents Dinner, because during the pandemic, we didn't have it for a while, because obviously we could not gather in large groups, so we hadn't had it for a while, and it was our first year having it back. And so then I was talking to the First Lady up on stage, which was very, very cool. And then the president came over to say, like, hi, I think more to his wife. But he came over and he was on the stage and he was, he was talking to me and he was, like, giving me the whole spiel and whatever. I don't know. It's like we get to talk to him on a regular basis, but at the White House, but that's like not the same, again, when you're shouting questions and they're far away and whatever. But it was a really cool interaction, and everyone was like texting me. They're like, I see you talking to the president on stage right now. And it was a really fun and enjoyable moment at the Correspondence Dinner.
Yeah, I think mine's kind of similar. Not as many celebrities come as they did during the Obama years. It's not as like cool, I guess, because like they have really stopped coming. We are trying to fix that. Celebrities come, please, make it cool again. Last year was my first year on the dais, and I had a very interesting seat. I was sitting between the second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, and the vice president. And so like that was another one of those you belong in every room you find yourself in moments, because you're also like looking at all these hundreds of people with a lot of cameras, and you're like, do I have a double chin? Is there food on my shirt? And so like talking to them for like 2.5 hours the whole time as both some of the most powerful people in our country, also like kind of understanding their humanity and why they got into public life and the kinds of things that they find interesting, and they're much more, the actual subjects and the substance of the conversations are off the record, so we can't share any, but it does, so that means they will come and they're much more like laid back and will kind of talk about anything, and I think that it is an honor that most people will never get, to have that much time with folks like that. I think that to me is the most fascinating part.
And if I could just add one quick thing to that. First of all, last year I was like sitting in the audience and I had been up there before, and I spent so much time when I was up there thinking like everyone was staring at me and food was in my teeth. No, everybody's eating. They're doing other stuff. Don't worry about it. Like no one's like actually paying attention to you. And I was like smiling like the whole time, and like no one is actually looking. But the one cool celebrity story I have is that one year Kerry Washington came when I was early on, and we were talking about the journalist. You asked me if I watched Scandal, so this is for you. Kerry Washington came one year, and I was very, very excited because Scandal was on at that time, Olivia Pope sort of thing. You can see why I might be very, very, very excited about that particular one. And there are other casting characters from Scandal were there too, and I met them. But I really wanted to meet Kerry Washington. And so I looked in the book and figured out where she was. So I went up to like the very front of the room and I was like, hey, I covered the White House. Like, I'd love to get a photo with you. And the security were like, ma'am, Ms. Washington isn't taking photos tonight. And I was really bummed out, I was like, oh my gosh, I've been waiting for this like for months. And I started to walk away, and I started to talk to someone else at her table who was like an official who I knew, or something like that. And then they tapped me on the shoulder and they were like, ma'am, please come over here. She feels really bad, like she'll take the photo with you. So I get this quick photo. And by the way, it's like a terrible photo, so it's not online. It's just blurry. It's really bad. But she tapped me and I came back and I got the photo and I was like, this is so exciting. 2 days later, it broke that she was pregnant. And I realized she didn't want to take the photo. So I'm saying it wasn't pregnant because she was pregnant. And I think that she didn't want, you got your arms all around somebody, and it wasn't public yet. But Kerry Washington did come. I did get my grainy photo with her. That's my highlight.
So we will turn it to the audience for questions now. We have 2 students with a microphone. If you just raise your hand, one of them will come around to you. There's one all the way, there's 2 back there.
Hi, my name is Jenna. Before I get to my question, I'd like to say that as journalists, you guys know more than anyone how powerful our words are, and it is your guys' responsibility to be careful with your words and the things that you say because it can leave a huge impact. And so for that, I'd like to mention the fact that by stating that it is a Israel-Hamas conflict minimizes and trivializes what is actually going on. It is a humanitarian crisis and a genocide of the Palestinian people. So I ask that you be mindful of how you phrase these things. That being said, as journalists, why haven't we heard anything about the 115 journalists in Gaza that have been martyred? You guys are always advocating for journalists, and here you are today telling us how amazing it is to be a journalist and be able to spread the truth, and yet we aren't hearing anything about anything happening in Gaza, and there's no outcry or support for your colleagues overseas.
Sure. I appreciate the question. I also appreciate the reminder for us always to be thinking about the words that we say, because that is extremely important. And I think I can speak for a friend that the both of us take that very seriously.
Absolutely.
I think it hasn't come up because that wasn't the kind of topic of conversation. We were talking about something else. But to the 150 folks that are journalists that are out there, there's no one. The work that I do doesn't feel like my life is in danger often, right? It takes a certain type of bravery and a certain type of tenacity to do the work that they're doing. It is a nightmare to hear that those people are there and are being killed for doing the job of informing the world of what's happening. And when it comes to journalists over in the Middle East, there has not been a lot of access to see what is happening. And as reporters,
Right.
our job is to always think about the reasons why people don't want us to see things. And those 150 people and the hundreds of others that are there and are continuing to go back and forth, some of them that are White House correspondents or former White House correspondents that risk their lives to tell the truth about what's going on over there, are some of the bravest people on this planet.
And I think you raised a very, did you sit down? Sorry, I can't see.
Jenna, there she is.
There you
Yeah.
go. Sorry, I wanted to make sure I was addressing you directly. I think you raised a really important point about the broader, longer-term two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, and also the different conflict that we're seeing right now. Right? There's the longer historical context of a two-state solution, Israel, a separate Palestinian state, and then there's also the fighting that's taking place right now, and that's getting all wrapped up together. And there are longer historical implications and other things that are going on. It's important to distinguish between whether we're talking about Gaza or we're talking about the West Bank, whether we're talking about the Palestinian Authority, all of those things. As far as what Eugene was saying, one of the biggest difficulties is that our colleagues have not had access to being able to get inside of Gaza to be able to report on some of these things. And it is why so many of the news organizations have also been pushing Israel to allow that to happen, to allow the journalists to be able to get in. It's also very important when we're telling these stories to talk about the number of Palestinian deaths that there have been in this conflict, and to write stories about like what the Biden administration did today, where they're issuing an executive order on violence and extremism by settlers, and they're sanctioning them. I don't know if you saw that this has happened today. They're issuing sanctions against individuals now and taking away visas and making sure that we're writing all of those stories as well as what is happening on a day-to-day basis, but those sorts of things too. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
And Jenna, I just want to say that it takes a lot of bravery for you to stand up and do that. So I want to say thank you for that, because it is not easy to stand up in front of, some losers from Washington, D.C. who think they know everything, and to hold us accountable. So thank you for that.
Did that answer your question, though?
Not really. I just want to say that, when you say that
No, I think the point that me and Fran were making were that Israel has done a lot to make sure that journalists can't get into Gaza. So we are depending on, you're correct, a lot of the folks that are already there. So journalists who are Palestinian, who live there, and are risking their lives to tell the full story about what's happening, just to be clear. It's not that we haven't seen it, it's that the access that, larger organizations who have a lot of resources and could send people there and spend a lot of time there are not getting that access.
I think Matt Fay had a question as well back there. Okay.
Yes, thank you for the event today. In recent years, political press, which both of you are members of, have been under constant fire from both right and left for different reasons. While right criticized it for for publishing fake news and stuff like this, it has often been criticized from the left for so-called both-sidism and for the fact that often political press tries to cover everything. In a pursuit of covering both sides of a question, they really skew it when the question is one-sided. So as political journalists, how do you approach balancing your questions and articles so that on one hand they reflect both sides, but on the other hand they don't trivialize some non-trivializable viewpoints?
Did you say that last part again? Sorry, I couldn't hear the last part.
Yeah, how do you balance the fact that, yes, you need to cover both sides, but then on some questions, one side is superior to the other, and it would be a mistake to cover both of them equally. How do you balance this?
I mean, I think part of our jobs as journalists, and this has started to change over the years, is as people have started to really think about what does objectivity mean, right? And the way that I approach my job, and I'm very fortunate to work at a place that allows me to do that, is to call balls and strikes, meaning that if one side is doing something, it is not my job to say, the political fractures in Washington, D.C., Congress can't get anything done. No, one of the reasons that Congress can't get anything done right now is because the House Republican Conference is almost impossible to corral. And so the Speaker of the House can't do that. There are a lot of people in that conference that don't want to work, that are not there for the bills, they're there for other reasons, right? And so I think those kinds of things as reporters, it's fine to say. Not everyone agrees with me, right? I don't know if you agree with me. Not everyone agrees with me, and I think you are right that journalists have, and I think the Trump presidency taught us a lot of lessons in that way. Whereas, you can't just take for face value, and we should have never been taking for face value what powerful people tell us, because there's a reason they're telling it in one way or another, and it's a reason they're telling us, right? And so I think there are shifts that are happening. I think the both-sidisms also frustrates me at times as a reporter, because it has never been more important for us to not BS the public, right? Because an uninformed public is only good for bad politicians who want to do bad things, right? If we give you guys all of the information that they are trying to keep secret, if they're not doing bad things with it, then they should be fine with you guys having that information and voters having that information. And so I'm always pushing to, and my husband is always pushing me to be more forceful, to be extremely honest about what's happening. And I do a lot of, I have a contract with MSNBC, and so I spend a lot of time on television talking about these issues. And one of the things that I'm constantly trying to do is not try to equalize everything, right? You should be talking to everybody, right? I think there is something that happens with Democrats where they don't want us to talk to certain types of Republicans, right? You shouldn't talk to them. You shouldn't platform them. I think we're still working through what that means as journalists. But you can talk to them, but then it is your job to analyze the things that they're saying and actually put it into context, right? I think the word lie is something that over the Trump administration that journalists in papers had a hard time figuring out whether or not that was a word you could say, right? Because the word lie has a certain connotation. It means that you think you're in that person's head, right? And so figuring out what's a lie and when you can say it and feeling confident and comfortable saying it is something that I think there are a lot of pressures not to do that, but I think every day that journalists should continue to push against those pressures.
No, that's been a real, I think, to your point, struggle in the industry, because in journalism school, you're taught that if someone says they believe something, you have to say, so-and-so said they believe. You can't know that they believe that. You can't know that someone thinks something. It's so-and-so said they think this. And that's been a real struggle in terms of whether to use the word lie, because then you're saying the connotation is like, you know that they're motivated by knowing something isn't true and then continuing to do that behavior. But to your point, at a certain, when things have been proven factually to be wrong again and again and again and again, and a person keeps repeating something, then what do you call that? I think that's been, you said it, not me. And I think various news institutions are trying to, figure out how to handle that with Donald Trump being in, being the potential and potentially likely Republican nominee again, and how you approach that then if he then gets elected president. Like, what are the things that you might do differently even as a reporter, between now and the way that he was covered before.
Yeah. And I think something that's really interesting that's happened over the last years is journalism used to be like a very old white man gig, and that was kind of all that was happening. It was just a bunch of old white guys who were doing the job. Then they let white women in, and then black men came in, and then brown folks came in, and then black and brown women came in, and so what has changed and why people do feel more comfortable calling balls and strikes is because there are different conversations that you can have now, right? Like different people thinking different things. And, when you say something like Donald Trump, the question of whether or not Donald Trump is racist is one that comes up and people always ask us. What I will say is that Donald Trump has said racist things, right? That is a different thing, and that is something that I can factually point to. And I think that is what's really important as a journalist. If you can factually point to something, just because it makes someone uncomfortable, that's not my problem. If not you specifically, but the royal you, if someone is uncomfortable with something that I've written, if it's true, I don't care. You know what I mean? As long as it's true, that is what our job is.
Yeah, no, just to build on that too. The great thing about print journalism, I feel like, is we can put those things in context. Right, yeah. We can put the statement of what someone said. And by the way, I think that we should be putting out the statements of what people are saying, even if they're not true. We need to draw attention to the fact that this person keeps repeating this thing and fact check, it's not true. But we have the ability, I feel like, in print to then put that context underneath of it, saying and here's why this, that, and the other, this has previously been looked at by this court, this court, this court, yeah. Or, here's why we're saying something's a racist attack or racially charged, because this is a person who's made these claims this time, this isn't a one-time thing.
Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? We have one back there and then one up here after.
Good questions, guys. This is fun.
Hi, my name is Bo. A little bit to what she was adding on, I've noticed in the past couple months, since the Palestinian-Israeli October 7th event happened, the language surrounding it has been tread very, very, very lightly, especially the press secretary. And even from reporters, I've noticed a lot more softballs than questions that I'd like to see answered. So my question is, how taboo is a question? Where do you draw the line on a question? Can you cross a line? Can you say too much? Can you get kicked out of the correspondence?
Out of the briefing room? I mean, it's really hard to be. It typically wouldn't be for a question, not with this administration. Yeah, I mean, also probably most likely not. As a member of the board of the WHCA, we would fight that with the administration.
Well, and actually, the WHCA has in the past fought when people had their park passes, taken away. because of perceived questions that they've asked or people didn't like them, going to court and helping to fight those sorts of things. So that hasn't, and I don't think that I can't recall that.
I mean, to answer your question about whether or not you can cross a line with the question or what's taboo, we're not really talking to each other about like, what are you allowed to ask, right? As far as I'm concerned, I can ask literally anything. There's a respectful way to do it because my family's from the South, so like, respect people. There's a certain way that you should be asking it, but I think the most important thing is this something that the American people want to know? We don't always get it right. You said you said that you felt like our questions were too softball. There are other people that feel like our questions, when it comes to the Middle East, have been too hard and have been too this-sided, or we've been focusing on the wrong things. And so we're never going to be able to please everybody. I think the hope when we sit down and do both the briefing and kind of doing our jobs overall is tough questions that are backed up by facts, that the American public, and when you're talking about foreign policy, the international public deserves to know. Not just wants to know, right? But like deserves to know. Because at the end of the day, you guys are the reasons, are the thing that keeps democracy going, right? Democracy only works because we say it does, right? Like, and we're seeing that now where there's attacks on democracy, and we're seeing, different politicians attacking and stretching the institutions and wanting to knock those really important institutions down. And so our job is to not to prop up those institutions per se, but to make sure that the questions that we're asking give you guys the information you need to go to the ballot box and make those decisions, to be able to give you guys the information to, if you don't like the answer, to go protest outside of Biden's, whatever that he's doing. There's been happening a lot, or internally, there's been a lot of that happening too. And so I don't think, there are obvious questions that are off limits, but like substantive, personal questions would be weird in the briefing room. But other than that, substantive questions about the policy issues and the politics that the White House is engaging in should never be off limits.
I think your point about respect is an important one, though. It's about like being respectful when you're having that back and forth, like being forceful, right? Like we're there to do a job, but also being respectful of your other colleagues. If Eugene's asking a question, I'm not going to start interrupting Eugene, you know what I mean, to like start yelling something or whatever. And in fact, if sometimes they'll try to use other reporters as a foil, I feel like, because if like someone's talking and they want to like stop, they'll call on someone else to try and shut it down. No. I wait until that person is done, with whoever the reporter is answering their series of questions before I start getting into mine, because I'm not gonna cut off another reporter when they're getting in if they're getting in a heated back and forth with the press secretary at all. Yeah. Just as I would hope that someone wouldn't do that to me.
And our job is to see her as power to me, right? Like she is representing power and everything that means, especially in this country. And if you are a reporter, and there aren't really any reporters in there that are scared to do that. If you are a reporter that doesn't want to hold power accountable, the physical manifestation of power accountable, then like do a different job, right? Like it is, the American people depend on us to get information. And like I said, we don't always get it right. You know what I mean? That is something I think as reporters and as journalists, we often are scared to say, but like everybody makes mistakes. We have to learn lessons from different administrations, and we change the way that we do things, and we talk a little bit differently, and we ask questions a little bit more forcefully. And at the courts, I think it often reminds us of things that we learn and the reasons why we wanted to get into journalism in the first place.
And that sometimes even changes from day to day. There have been briefings where, like even seconds later, I wished I had asked a different question. I wished I had asked the question differently. Yeah. It might have gotten a better answer. Like why did I ask this? And it's a constant learning process, to his point. And you just try to go back the next day, and you just try to do a better job. You just try to keep getting better at it.
think we have time for one or two more questions. There was one up here. Okay, there's two up here. We can end on those two.
What are some skills that you feel have helped you achieve success in y'all's careers?
Curiosity. Like, curiosity is at the core of being a journalist, and really at the core of kind of like just being in work, right? Like a lot of jobs require curiosity. Why are we doing it this way? What happens over here? What you got over there? What you hiding? Like for me, like when in my family, they call me nosy. I've always been, like I was always the kid that was like, but why? Like 4 years old, mom was like, but why? Why? And so I think curiosity is at the core of, and it's actually a skill. Like you actually have to learn how to kind of hone your nosiness into curiosity and actually utilize it when you're sitting across from someone. I think one thing that is an overlooked skill often is the skill of like human to human interactions. Like doing an interview and not making the person comfortable, right? Like and I'm not meaning like make them feel safe. It's not about making them feel safe, but you need to make sure that they feel like they can have a conversation with you, even when you're trying to, get the answer. I don't know why I just did that motion. It's weird. Edit that out. But when you are sitting across from one and trying to get the information that we were just talking about with Bo, doing that in a way where the person doesn't clam up, right? Because that is possible to have that back and forth, to have it be very tense, but not have it be disrespectful, and not have the person like get up and throw their microphone and walk away, because then I don't have the information to give you guys to do that. But I think those two things are kind of what first pop into my mind.
I'm really passionate about it. I mean, that's the key thing, and I would encourage all of you to do something you're passionate about, because then it'll make you want to work harder. It'll make you, want to put in all the hours and do the work and spend the time getting better at it. But there is discipline. I mean, there's a lot of discipline in that too. It isn't as simple, right, as, well, we just show up to the White House press briefing, and pose some questions. No, it's like I'm getting up in the morning, I'm thinking like, what do I think the news is today? I'm in the shower thinking about what do I think the questions are today? I'm listening every time I'm listening to an interview or the president, I'm thinking of new questions for it, I'm writing them down. I mean, all of the time. There are times when it can be really tiring, and it's like, oh my gosh, I really just don't feel like I have any gas left in the tank. But forcing yourself to keep on in those moments and taking the time to be prepared. So I would say it's like a passion thing, a preparation, a discipline. I feel like there's probably other things I'm leaving off of that list, but all of those things.
Yeah, I also think like storytelling ability. So like being able to, no matter what kind of journalism you get into, whether it's, because I've worked on video, I've done and do podcasting, I do, short interviews on cable television, I write a newsletter which is shorter, I write long stories, I write profiles, and at the heart of it is just like telling stories. And I think all humans have a story that we should be trying to seek and tell and share with others. And so figuring out how best to tell stories, I think is also really important, because that can be used. And even for those of you who like don't want to get in journalism, you want to get into politics, that's also storytelling, right? If you become a comms person, you're gonna be telling the story of the principal that you're working for. If you are the principal, you're gonna have to tell the story of yourself. Like all of these things are about storytelling and making sure that people understand who other people are.
Did Gabe
that's helpful.
Still have a question? Okay. We'll end on Gabe's question.
Hi. Hi. I'd like to thank you all for first coming out here and doing this event for us. We really do appreciate it. You mentioned something earlier that kind of informed your role to become a journalist, and you said it wasn't to necessarily be a powerful person, but to hold people in power accountable. And then you also mentioned that one of the ways that you view the press secretary is to view them as a person with power, to view them with power, to remind you to hold them accountable. Very similarly to how many of us could view you all right now with the positions that you have, which is very powerful in journalism and political journalism. So I'd like to kind of piggyback off of that, and also the first and third questions that were posed to you here today, just to ask you all, what plans or efforts do you two have as individual journalists to hold our government accountable for the role that they may have and the atrocities that are currently happening against the Palestinians? And if there are such efforts or plans, can you elaborate on them?
I guess, what do you mean efforts or plans? Do you mean?
As journalists, so investigative reporting or just reporting in general, breaking stories.
Yeah.
So in general, we have a very important role, I think, to question our administration, the administration officials. I mean, and to your point, like, not just take what they're saying at face value, but to really press them for information on what their plans are, what they're planning to do. For instance, months ago, when Biden said that they were going to need to do something about the extremist settlers, then nothing happened, right? Nothing happened immediately with that. So one of the things that we do is ask, hey, you said you were going to do something about this. What are you planning to do? When are you planning to do it? When are these visa restrictions that you're planning to have? You say that you are pressing for a two-state solution. You know, how are you doing that? Is this coming in calls with the Israeli prime minister? You know, when is the last time you talked to the PA? You know, all of those things, whether this topic or any topic, right, is staying on them and reminding them, you said this before. You have to come, though, prepared with facts, though, and say, you know, you said this in this month. Like, what have you guys done on this yet? What is your plan to do that? And that's a lot of what I think the press briefing on its better days, like, that's what it should be, is us holding them accountable for the things that they have promised that they would do on any policy or while running for president of the United States. This was your policy as a candidate. Why haven't you taken this, that, or the other action on any of the topics of the things that you're doing right now?
I think the most important thing is to take seriously the outcry that is happening in both America and around the world and what's happening, right? So first, as a reporter, you have to, like, realize and accept that the things that people are seeing and watching and crying out for are important, right? Because as reporters, we do get to decide what is, and our editors get to decide what's written, right? And I think there has been years of us figuring out how to open that door, making it bigger, and so more stories can be told. And you know, something that I do now and will continue to do is talk to advocates on both sides of the issue, and push the administration to answer the questions that those people have, right? They may be questions that I have, right? But it's my job to take the questions from the advocates, from those protesters, and take those to the administration and say, why are you not calling it X, Y, and Z? You know, I did a story, I can't want to say this year, but it was last year, that looked at and talked about what Vice President Harris was saying and telling the administration, and how she was speaking and how it sounded differently than the president had been talking and saying and talking about this issue, right? They didn't like that story, right? Because they want to show like one strong administration that all speaks the same language. But what was happening was she was at the tip of the spear at a different way that the administration has started to talk about the issue, right? There was one way at the very beginning when the president sat down that he was talking about what was happening, right? And these issues are extremely complicated, right? Extremely complicated. And so he was talking about it in like this kind of like diplomatic sense, right? Because he doesn't want to piss off Bibi Netanyahu, and he wants to make sure that he still has the power over Bibi Netanyahu and at some point can utilize those tools, right? But that is not my job to care about that. Right? It's not my job to care that his relationship with Bibi Netanyahu stays where it is or how he utilizes that. In the future, it's my job to hold him accountable. Why are you guys not talking about what's happening to the Palestinians? Why is there one focus, or it felt like to a lot of people in this country, it felt like that. So why do people in this country feel like that if you guys are saying you care about both, right? Those kinds of things are really important. I think, coming out to do things like this and hearing these kinds of things, if you don't think I'm going to take back some of these questions back to the administration, and I continue to do that. I've been at events with both Biden and Harris where protesters have come out and tried and talked to those protesters afterwards. There was a woman during the Christmas parties that was at the vice president's house and had kind of a cloak that she turned into a sign and asked similar questions that you guys have asked today about what's happening to the Palestinians. And the next day, after her video went up, I called her, talked to her, did an entire top on it. On a top is what, like the top part of the newsletter that I write, about shining light on that conversation. So that's like our role in this, right? We don't have like a policy role. We don't have an advocacy role. Right. Our job is to also not pick winners and losers, if that makes sense, right? And if thousands and thousands and thousands of people are dying and thousands and thousands and thousands of people are in danger of famine, and that's just a fact, it is our job to say, no, wait a second now, White House, you guys said that you cared about these people. Why is this happening, and whose fault is it? And why aren't you responding to the thousands of protesters who are showing up outside of your door? I remember when we were doing the APEC conference, we wrote about how many protesters were showing up there to protest on this particular issue as well. And I 100% agree with you. I appreciate the questions as well, because as I talk about our job being to ask the questions that are in the public interest and what you all care about, 100%. It's helpful to hear from all of you about what you guys think that you want to hear from us, because you want to hear from them. You want to hear us ask those questions because you want to hear from your public officials, and we're the ones in the position who can do it. There's also a generational shift and a generational thinking about these things, right? I think there are a lot of reasons I'm sure we don't have time for me to go through the entire history of that conflict, but younger people, black and brown people in this country who tend to be younger, or the younger people tend to be blacker and browner, are looking at this, and the way that that's been really fascinating to me is like they see it in the same way that they see like a George Floyd or police brutality here in this country, right? You see the government doing something to people, or a government doing something to citizens. And that has completely changed the conversation. And so what I will say to all of you who are interested in journalism, and more importantly, interested in politics and policy, is to continue to push, not just us, but definitely us, but also your elected leaders in the ways that you want to do it. Because I think one of the things that folks haven't fully comprehended in DC is how much power is in kind of the Gen Z, we're kind of older millennials now, but the younger millennials and Gen Z folks, and there's a different viewpoint on this issue and a lot of other issues. And if you feel like you want something to change, you guys are the ones that are going to be able to do it. You guys are the ones that will have the power now, and will eventually, I have no doubt, based on the great questions today, have the actual power and the tools of government to shape it in the way that you see fit. So I'm just happy that we've been able to have this conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone for coming out tonight, and thank you so much to you two for joining us tonight. Let's give them a round of applause. Yeah, and just a reminder, like Audrey said, our first meeting of the semester is next Tuesday at 5:30, and then we also have Pizza and Politics at the Union on noon on Friday. So hope to see you guys there, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you. Great job.
Thank you.